Good morning. We on? Good morning. Our first speaker this morning is going to be talking about a case that if you've had just about a day and a half experience in the UFO community, you have heard of the Betthy and Barney Hill case. Kathleen Marden is the niece of Betthy Hill, who unfortunately recently passed away. You will recognize Kathleen from not only being actively involved in MUFON, but also on a History Channel program, which I was very honored to have her on, which I produced and wrote for the History Channel, called UFO Hunters, and she was a critical part in telling the story of the UFO community. Here to tell you about the Betthy and Barney Hill case and to play actual tapes from the regression from Betthy Hill and when she did her work with Benjamin Simon is Kathleen Marden, author of the new book, Captured, the Betthy and Barney Hill UFO Experience. So let me welcome to you, Kathleen Marden.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. I have quite a lengthy presentation here. I've had to cut and cut and cut in order to have it fit into this time frame. So without further ado, I want to begin so we can get in as much as possible. Whoops. Okay, this is Barney Hill, about 1960. This is Betthy. She was Betthy Stewart at that point, and this is about 1958. Betthy and Barney met in 1956 during the relocation of her house from Islington Street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to State Street that was nearby. She was staying in a boarding house, and it just so happened that Barney was on vacation in Portsmouth and was also staying at that boarding house. They met and became good friends at that point, wrote to each other. He was living in Philadelphia. And a friendship developed into a romantic relationship, and they were married in Camden, New Jersey on May 12, 1960. Barney was forced to stay in Philadelphia for approximately a little less than a year, actually, after they were married until he received a job transfer. This is a photograph of their house after it had been relocated and shrubbery had been planted and it had been repainted. On September 17, 1961, Betthy and Barney left on a short vacation to Niagara Falls and then up to Montreal. Betthy, who was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire, had a week-long vacation. And on the previous Friday evening on his way to work, Barney decided that it might be nice to be able to do something special with Betthy. They hadn't really had a good honeymoon trip together, and Niagara Falls was a popular honeymoon spot. So he asked his supervisor at the South Postal Annex in Boston for a few days off from his job as a distribution clerk. It was granted, so they left at about 5:30 in the morning on that Sunday morning. They traveled to Niagara Falls, spent the night there, went up into Ontario, spent the night near the Thousand Islands, and then went on to Montreal on Tuesday morning, September 19. Barney made a decision after getting lost in Montreal a couple of times and not being able to read the road signs that were in French and not having a good map, that he wanted to just get outside of the city and that they would stay somewhere along the route on the way back home to New Hampshire. Somewhere along the way, they heard that a hurricane was coming up the coast, so they decided that they might drive all night. If they grew tired, they would stop at a cabin or a motel along the way. They probably took Route 112 from Montreal to Route 141 to Coaticook, Quebec. And The tapes that you're going to hear are excerpts from the hypnosis sessions that Betthy and Barney had with Dr. Benjamin Simon in the spring of 1964. Barney was having anxiety and physiological problems related to this 2-hour period of missing time, and they were referred to Dr. Benjamin Simon. He received his MD from Washington University School of Medicine in 1931. He set up the psychiatric center at the Mason General Hospital. It was a 3,000-bed unit in Long Island, New York during World War II, where he had a high rate of success in treating combat neurosis and conversion hysteria in veterans returning from World War II. And he used a type of hypnosis that he had learned when he was in medical school that was different from what other psychiatrists were using. He had a very high rate of success with this, sometimes as an adjunct to narcosynthesis. He did not use narcosynthesis with Betthy and Barney. They were good deep trance subjects. Dr. Simon was awarded the Army Commendation Medal, the American Campaign Medal, and the Victory Medal during World War II, and he set up private practice in neuropsychiatry. At one point, he owned his own psychiatric hospital. He also taught at Yale and lectured at Harvard. Now, to get on to Betthy and Barney's trip, they stopped at a French-speaking restaurant in Cotacook, Quebec, for an early evening snack. This is a photograph of Cotacook. If you remember reading The Interrupted Journey, this is the point which John Fuller didn't really mention in the book. He sort of morphed it into the Colebrook restaurant, but they did stop at this restaurant. They walked into the restaurant, and Barney immediately went on guard because he saw two young men who were sporting duck-tail haircuts, although they were not dressed as hoodlums. He thought that he might be the subject of harassment, being a black man in the company of a white woman. This did not happen. He had a very pleasant experience at the restaurant. These were very nice young men. He had simply stereotyped them because of the haircut they were wearing, and he really hated the idea of stereotyping people. So he was not pleased with himself later on when he realized he had stereotyped them. So they continued on their route after leaving the restaurant. The food wasn't entirely satisfactory, but they headed south on Route 141, I believe. It was a gravel road that would lead them into New Canaan, Vermont. Along the way, they passed prosperous dairy farms south of Cotacook. And I'd like to play recording 1 now. This is Barney's explanation to Dr. Simon about how he was feeling that night.
It was just a continuous drive down. I felt in good spirits. I felt in high spirits. I was well rested from the night before, and we had spent a delightful day. And I knew I could drive on from the White Mountains down to Portsmouth, so I didn't stop. I didn't feel too tired.
And could you hear that okay? It needs to be louder. I thought so too. What he was saying is that it was a continuous drive down. He felt in good spirits. He was well rested the night before. They'd spent a delightful day in Montreal, and he was just driving along and in a very good mood. Next, they would have approached U.S. Customs at New Canaan, Vermont. They passed through customs after their trunk was searched, and they decided to stop in Colebrook, New Hampshire. This would have been approximately at about 9:15 in the evening. They gassed up the car and decided to have an evening snack, and a cup of coffee. It would probably be their last opportunity to have something to eat and drink that night along their journey. As they were leaving the restaurant, Betthy and Barney both glanced at a clock that was over the ladies' room. I went to a number of different restaurants in Colebrook in my research for this, and I discovered that this is the one restaurant that actually did have a clock. It didn't have a clock now. It had holes in the wall where a clock once probably hung. And it was about 10 o'clock when they left. One said 10, one said 10:05 when they looked at the clock. Betty's eyes were drawn to a new light in the sky near Lancaster, New Hampshire. On October 21st, 1961, NICAP investigator Walter Webb interviewed Betthy and Barney at their home for a period of 6 hours. They told him that they first spotted a moving star-like object in the southwest sky near Groveton, New Hampshire. Actually, it would not have been Barney who spotted this. It was Betthy. Barney was driving and watching the road. Betthy was just glancing up at the bright sky that night. She said that the object moved from below the moon upward to the west of the moon and then headed in a northerly direction. The couple initially thought that they were observing a falling star, only it fell upward, a plane, or a satellite. And that's in Walter's original confidential report. On November 25th, 1961, C.D. Jackson, who is on the left, who was a senior engineer for IBM, and Robert Homan on the right, who was a writer for IBM, were interested in interviewing Betthy and Barney. They went to their house and interviewed them, and this is when they actually became aware of the 2-hour period of missing time. They realized that even allowing for stops along their way home and slow driving during a certain period, they had still arrived home much later than anticipated. They knew this immediately when they arrived home. But it was on November 25th, 1961, that the full impact of the 2 hours of missing time hit them. Well, this is Lancaster, New Hampshire. They probably passed through Lancaster at about 10:50 p.m. And they made their first stop just south of Twin Mountain. It was at about 11:20 p.m., and that's 17 miles south of Lancaster. And let's listen to what Betthy had to say about her observation.
2. And Delphi was restless. So I told Barney, and we thought we should let Delphi out, and it would give us a chance to look at the star through the binoculars. And so that we drove along, and we came to a parking space off the highway, one that had been built there. And I guess it was so people could drive off to look at the view. And there were woods all around. And there was a couple of trash barrels. And Barney said we should look out for bears. And I was looking through the binoculars at the object, and Barney was saying it was a satellite, but it wasn't. It was moving fast, but it went in front of the moon, and I saw it. I saw it traveled across the whole face of the moon, and it was odd-shaped, and it was flashing all different colored lights.
3.
Continue with the slide, with the recording, please.
We were standing in the highway in the forestry section of the White Mountains on Route 3. The first time we stopped to get a better look at this light that was moving through the sky and coming toward us, I could see this happening, and I said, "It's a plane." And Betthy said, "Look how it is flying." And I got Dulcie out the car and put her chain on her, and then I went to the trunk of my car and I opened it and took out a gun that I had concealed there and put it in my pocket. And then I said, "Give me the binoculars," and I looked, and I could see that this thing that I thought was a plane had made a turn to the left toward Vermont and kept turning and started coming right back. And I thought I had only seen this happen when I was in Philadelphia, and I used to be a mail truck driver, and there was a box located near the international airport, and just where I would stop, I would see planes coming in to land with the lights on, and it was a very funny feeling to see this large thing coming to land. And I thought of that when I was standing on the highway, that this thing is coming right toward us. And I said, "Come on, Betthy, let's go." And I quickly returned to the car. And I said, "Oh, Betthy, you're trying to make me see something that is not there." And I would slow down and look at her insistence that, "Look what it's doing." And I said, "Well, forget it. It's just a plane. It's probably some flyer or something." And yet I felt very strange about the whole thing because I could not hear any sound. And I wanted to hear some sound of a motor. And I could not quite understand why it was now following us off to the right. And when we would go around a bend in the road where it would be obstructed from view, it would appear after we had gone around, and there it was coming around the other side of the mountain. And I began to really feel very alarmed and hoped that some traffic, some car, or I could see a state police to come by and say, "Look at that, it is following us," but no one came by.
And
4.
recording. So those of you who are very familiar with the Hill abduction case have probably read up to this point that Barney removed the gun from the trunk of the car at the field south of Indian Head because he was frightened of this craft. We've just learned in this new evidence that it didn't happen that way. He was walking Dulcie near the woods. It was a picnic area. There were trash cans, and he removed the gun in case he encountered a bear along the edge of the woods. Next, at approximately 11:45, Betthy and Barney passed the Cannon Mountain aerial tramway. This was about 8 miles south of Twin Mountain, and their first stop was actually about 4 miles south of Twin Mountain. So they had driven about 4 miles. And next recording, please.
Now, when we got by Cannon Mountain, and there's a lighted area on the top. I've been up there, and I think the lights might have been from the restaurant. And as I was watching, the lights went out. And because I had thought that if anybody was up there, they would have been able to get a good look at this object, because it went right behind the restaurant. And then there's a lookout tower in that same area. And when I was watching this to see what this object would do, and I didn't see it. I don't know if it went down in the valley between the two mountains, or if there was it turned its lights off. But then when we came out by the old man of the mountain, there it was. It looked almost as if it was bouncing along the top of the mountain, the ridge. And it would go down a little bit on the other side, and I would lose sight of it. And I kept wondering why they were following us.
And recording. Barney decided to stop again just south of Cannon Mountain and right in the area of the old man of the mountain, the granite stone face that was the symbol of the state of New Hampshire. I took this photograph of Profile Lake. I'm not certain that this is exactly where they pulled over, but it was at approximately 11:47 in the evening. And let's listen to what Barney had to say about his observation. Next recording, please. 5.
When I get past Old Man of the Mountain, it will be a good area to look and see this thing. And I am going to report it. It wasn't far. It was about 1,000 feet, I guess. I know it is not a Piper Cub. It was too fast. It moved too fast. It would go up and down. It could go back so fast. It could go away and come back toward the west, and without looking as if it turned, it would come straight back. It would go like I think of a paddle and a ball with a rubber. And you hit the ball, and the ball goes straight out and comes straight back without a circle. And I think only a jet could fly that fast. And I am hoping I can find a good place where I can stop and really see this thing, whatever it is.
End recording. Next, about 1 mile south of Cannon Mountain at approximately 11:55, Betthy told Dr. Simon what she observed. I created the craft being the size that it is because Betthy, during one of our many trips up to the White Mountains, told me in a tape-recorded interview that it was as large as the granite stone face. The stone face actually fell off in 2004, so you don't see it there. You see what's left of it. And let's listen to what Betthy had to say about her observation.
6.
Well, all right, you take a cigar and you lie it flat on the desk.
Yes.
All right. Now, you stand the cigar up on one end, right straight up and down. This is what this did. And in the meanwhile, it gave the appearance of spinning all the time it was happening. It would go along straight, and then it would suddenly go right up straight, and then it would flatten out horizontally, and then it would drop down straight. And I mean, this seemed to be the overall pattern. It wasn't done in an exactly precise way, but it was sort of jerk. It would jerk up and then sort of flatten out. And so it was sort of it wasn't smoothly done. And as they got closer, they seemed to be this jumping back and forth in the sky.
End recording. Their next stop was at approximately 12:05 p.m., or I should say a.m. I have a mistake there. 4 miles south of the Old Man of the Mountain is the Flume Gorge and Visitor Center. They pulled in there and immediately left because the trees were too tall to be able to see anything. This is the Flume Gorge during the daytime. If you ever come to New Hampshire and go to Franconia Notch, you can hike up to the Flume Gorge. And 3 miles south of the Flume Gorge was Indian Head. It's another stone structure. And just south of the stone structure, actually almost across the street from it, Barney described what he saw next, and let's listen to what he had to say. 7.
And I see a wigwam, and I recognize this place, and I feel safe. I feel less in the barren hostility.
What is this place?
Wooded area.
What is this place?
It is Indian Head. I had been there before, and I feel comforted that I see a familiar place. And I think I will get a good look at this.
8. End recording, please. This was actually a wigwam at Natureland. Natureland is no longer there. I took this photograph at the Indian Head Resort. It was just north of Natureland and on the opposite side of the road. That's where you saw the cabins. And before Barney could have an opportunity to really pull off and get a better look at this thing, something happened. And about 1 mile south of Indian Head at 12:05, this happened. And I want to thank Walter Webb for permitting me to use this photograph that he took during his investigation. This is not the car that they were driving that night, and actually they were parked directly in the middle of the road, straddling the center line. But let's listen to what Barney described next.
I finally stopped at Indian Head because it was right there, large and hovering, and I could not understand this. So I knew I had the gun in my pocket, and I said, I will get out and get a better look. And I opened my car door and tried to brace my arms on the door and the roof of the car, and the motor was running and my arms were jiggling, so I stepped away from my car, and when I did, the object, which was to the right of the car on Betty's side, made a arc-like turn.
And this object was now 80 to 100 feet in the air to the right of the car before it made the arc-like turn. And next slide, let's listen to Barney's recording of what happened next.
Not a turn, but a swing in motion over to the left of my side. And I thought, my God, what is this thing? It's got to be a helicopter to just stay suspended like that. And it's just not making no sound. And I started walking across the highway to look at it. And as I walked further away from the car, I noticed with my binoculars that there were about 11 men now, I thought, looking down at me, and they suddenly made a turn to what I thought was a panel, and I could see their arms going up, and there was one that kept looking down, and I kept going closer, and I could see two red lights coming out from the tip of this thing that did not look like a plane at all or a helicopter, and I could see a long something coming down from the center, and I kept going closer and closer, and I thought, oh my God, what is this thing? And I felt myself being told to come closer, and I was greatly confused, and I blinked my eyes, and I thought, this can't be real. And I shook my head and turned it away and looked back, and I thought, oh God, it's there. What is this thing? And I put my hand toward my gun, and I could not put my hand there, and I could not understand why my hands kept going up with the binoculars, and I was told to keep the binoculars up and keep looking up and keep coming closer. No harm would come to me. And that's when I opened my hands, and the binoculars fell around my neck, and I ran screaming back to the car that they were going to capture us, and yet I could not understand what they wanted to capture us for. And I thought I should report this to the police if ever I could find a call box or anything or a restaurant open, because this was very unusual for something to do that. And I thought of the military, and I thought since they had on black jacket, the one looking at me had on a black jacket, he must have been a military officer, and yet I could not quite understand why they were doing what they were doing, and there was no sound coming from this thing just up there in the sky.
And recording. Betthy was seated in the car watching for oncoming traffic. The driver's side door was open, so the interior light was on in the car. And I'd like to play the next recording of what she was experiencing during that time frame.
10.
I started to slide across. I was going to get out on his side of the car because that door was still open a little bit. And I started to slide across the street because I was going to go out and get him. And just as I started to slide across the seat and I got the door most of the way open, he was running like mad down the street. And when I saw him coming, I sat up, and it's lucky I did afterwards because he threw the binoculars in the car, and they landed on the seat beside me. And I guess he was hysterical. He was, I don't know if he was laughing or crying, but he was saying that they were going to capture us. We had to get the hell out of there. They were going to capture us. And because the car motor was running, and he put the car in the first, and he stepped on the gas, and we started to take off very rapidly. And so he kept saying to me, look out and see them. They're right overhead. They're right directly over the head of our car. And so I did want to see them again. I mean, I was sort of afraid, but I wasn't that afraid. And so we were moving. We were going quite fast then. And so I wound down. I turned down the window on my side of the car, and I tried to put my body out through the window, and I looked up. And I looked, and I couldn't see a thing. But I kept looking and looking and looking up, and I couldn't see them. And I couldn't see any light. I couldn't see anything. I couldn't even see the sky. I couldn't see anything. And so then I pulled my head in, and I wound up the window of the car, and then I thought, well, maybe they're out the back, because I kept looking for the lights. And I looked out the back window, and I didn't see anything. And then, all of a sudden, there was this beep, 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 beep noise, and Barney said, "What's that? What's that? What's that noise?" And I said, "I don't know. It sounds, all I could think of is some kind of electrical signal. Somebody's, it's beep, 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 beep." And I thought, well, I wonder, oh, darn, why didn't I learn the Morse code? Because maybe this is the Morse code and I don't know it. And I thought, well, maybe it's electrical. It's a shock. Get it, I can. So I put my hand on the metal of the car, and I kept feeling and feeling, and I didn't feel any shock, no electric shock. But the whole car was vibrating, a little, kept vibrating.
End the tape.
11.
And I kept driving.
End, please. Okay. The Hills were at that point entering a phase of rapidly fading consciousness. Barney at a much faster rate and much more complete than Betthy. She retained memories along the way, and they would have passed through the village of North Woodstock. At that time, they thought that they had probably lost the craft. They continued driving on Route 3 on their way home. Betthy told me that along the way she recalled seeing a pumpkin head, and during one of my many trips up along that route, we located the Jack-o'-lantern Resort. It was 8 miles south of the field, and Betthy thought that that was probably what she recalled seeing. Now, let us review the time frame of the trip so far. And here's the pointer. They were in Colebrook at 10:05. They left Colebrook at 10:05. They were in Lancaster at about 10:50. They made their first observational stop. I have Mount Cleveland picnic area. That's the only picnic area that's there now. But Betthy felt that they had actually stopped at a different one nearby, but things had changed over the years. So they were at Mount Cleveland picnic area at about 11:20. They entered their close encounter stage of their observation. They passed Cannon Mountain at about 11:45, on to their second stop at about 11:50 near Indian Head, and or near the Old Man of the Mountain. And then they went on to Indian Head and made their third stop at about 12:15. They turned off Route 3 and crossed a steel frame bridge at about 12:45 a.m. And let us listen to the next recording, and Barney will describe what he recalled during hypnosis.
And driving, and I made a turn, and I never knew this, and I don't know why I had to make that turn.
End recording.
12. In a later
End recording, please. Okay. From our current knowledge, prior to this presentation, we thought that Barney was hurrying down the road to escape this UFO and quickly made this left-hand turn to escape and turned on to narrow mountain roads. That's what all of the skeptics told us. They told us that he turned onto those roads and became lost, and now we've just found out in his own words that that's not what happened. And he turned on to State Highway, Route 175 South. Route 3 was a U.S. highway. It was the major north-south route at that time. Now he's driving along Route 175. And he made another sudden left-hand turn onto a gravel road 2 miles from the bridge. And this road is Millbrook Road. Today it is paved about 2 miles up. It's a dead-end road. It dead ends 4 miles up. And this next recording is a conscious interview with Dr. Simon where Barney is explaining what he saw. Play recording.
Barney said the following.
It's puzzling because vaguely I could remember a red glow in the highway, and I always thought someone was doing something like that, like flagging me down.
Swinging a lantern?
No, well, yes, if a lantern had been in the hand.
Well, that would give you a red glow, wouldn't it?
No, but the glow wasn't coming from this out there.
Somewhere else.
The glow was just a large glow, and I thought, geez, my God, it can't be daytime.
You had a pretty large moon that night, didn't you?
Well, I thought about the moon, but the thing was right there on the highway, which I could never seem to understand. I have looked for that spot and looked for it. I said, now, how can the moon be on the highway in that kind of position? And I could never seem to find any terrain up there that would fit what I sort of dimly remembered this thing was sitting there like. And I kept remembering these men flagging me down, and then I sort of don't remember. Mm-hmm. And now I remember.
13.
They were just, you couldn't get a good look at them. Then I thought, well, you know, are they in a car and the car broken down, or what are they doing there? And Barney, of course, had to stop. And then he stops the car, and these men started to come up to the car. They separated. They came up in two groups. And when they started to do that, I get real scared. And the car motor died. The car stalled. And when they started coming up, Barney tried to start the car. He tried to start it, and you know how a motor of a car would just turn over, it won't fire. And he tried to start the car. And it won't start. And the medic goes, and I think, well, I can get away from this. If I get the car door open, I can run in the woods and hide. And I'm thinking it, and I just put my hand on the car door and open it. And the men come up, and they open it for me. And they open the car door, and there's not very big men. And there's 1, 2, 3. And one man puts his hand out. I don't know what happened.
We'll go right into
Barney
Barney's.
described
Barney's
the
recording.
same scene.
I looked, and I was being signaled to stop. And I thought, I wonder if there's an accident. I do have my gun. and I'll put my hand on it. I saw a group of men, and they were standing in the highway, and it was brightly lit up as if it was almost daylight, but not day. It was not the kind of light of day, but it was brightly lighted, and they were coming toward me. And I had not had any warning. As I had driven down this road before, I suddenly saw this brightly lighted area, or the area became brightly lighted. And I thought I saw a cluster of 6 men, because 3 came to me and 3 did not. I didn't think of the man in the sky in the machine that I saw. I just saw these eyes, and I closed mine. And I got out of the car, and I put my left leg on the ground, and 2 men helped me out. And I did not walk. I felt like I was being supported.
14.
And tape.
Out and
Okay, I want to thank the late Dave Baker's widow, Jerry, for permitting me to use the paintings that he did based upon Betty's and Barney's descriptions of the capture scene. And what you heard were actually excerpts from several different sessions with Dr. Simon that I pasted together to give you a fairly good and complete understanding of what they were seeing. Dr. Simon would ask Betty and Barney the same questions, maybe 3, 4, sometimes 5 times, and each time they would relate more detailed information. So I've tried to put this together so that you'd get, in this short period of time, we have a good understanding of what they observed and experienced. I did a comparative analysis of the hypnosis tapes that Betty gave me in 1996 vis-a-vis her Dreams or Recall, the paper she wrote in 1961, based upon a series of dreams that she had, lasted 5 days, and these occurred about 10 days to 2 weeks after they had their encounter. And I wanted to test Dr. Simon's hypothesis that Barney had merely absorbed Betty's dreams. In Betty's dreams, she stated that 8 to 11 men surrounded the car. And as you can see, both Betty and Barney told Dr. Simon that there were 6 men. Betty actually, and another recording, added a couple of more men that she saw approaching behind the 3 who went to her door. Barney closed his eyes, so we don't know if he had more than 6 or not. Betty said in her dreams that they surrounded the car. Betty and Barney both stated under hypnosis that they divided into 2 groups and approached the car. So we can see there's a discrepancy there between Betty's dreams and their hypnotic recall. Well, as we all know, they were taken down a path in the woods. into a craft that was sitting on the ground. It was not lighted. Betthy at this point struggled, tearing her dress, tore the hem out, tore the lining from waist to hemline in her struggle not to go on board the craft. And I wanted to do a comparative analysis of Betty's description of the aliens in her dreams vis-a-vis the hypnosis information and what they recalled under hypnosis. In Betty's dreams, she said that the aliens were dressed in light navy blue-gray uniforms with trousers and short sports jackets that, although they looked zippered, she couldn't observe a zipper. They had military-type caps. They had gray-toned skin with bluish lips. They had dark to black hair and eyes. They were very human in appearance, ranging from 5 feet to 5 feet 4 inches tall. They had very large, long noses. She compared them to a Jimmy Durante nose. And one man spoke English with a foreign accent. This is a painting of the leader done by David Baker, and what Betthy and Barney described is aluminum-colored, bumpy skin. The leader was approximately 5 feet tall. He was bald. He had a large chest cavity or trunk and spindly legs. He had a somewhat larger cranial structure than humans and a triangular-shaped face that tapered down to a small chin and jawline. There was a membrane in his mouth opening, and it flooded when the captors communicated in their own humming type of language. He had enlarged, slanted eyes with square corners and vertical cat-like pupils. The iris filled up most of the eye. You don't see that in David Baker's painting, but it's in writing and it's on audio tape. There was a tiny amount of a lighter white color that was observed, and it had a yellowish cast. Betthy and Barney understood the leader in English, although his lips did not move. They thought that it may have been telepathic communication, or perhaps, this is my idea, that it was some sort of advanced technological communication device. He was the most human-like of all of the captors. Next, this is David Baker's painting of the Examiner. Betthy and Barney were not sure if the Examiner was male or female. The Examiner had a very weak chin, and his or her features were much more feminine than the leader's. The Examiner and leader did not have ear cartilage or hair. The Examiner was only about 4.5 feet tall, about 6 inches shorter than the leader, not the 5 feet to 5 feet 5 inches tall in Betty's dreams. The Examiner communicated in English, but was very difficult to understand. The Examiner's mouth did not move, but when he or she communicated with the leader or with other members of the crew, the membrane inside his or her mouth fluttered. Both the leader and Examiner were dressed in black, tight-fitting clothing. They had long, narrow palms on their hands and 4 to 5 long, narrow fingers. The Examiner painting was stolen from Betty's house. So I commissioned forensic artist Patrick Richard. He's from New Mexico, and he does have a table here at this conference. He did this painting, and it's his artistic interpretation based upon Betty's descriptions, both written and on my transcription of the audio tapes of her hypnosis with Dr. James Harder from APRO. Betthy and Barney kept this little person secret. They wanted to test whether or not other people who claimed to be abducted actually had been. This is a person I call the supervisor. Betthy actually wondered if the supervisor was really the leader, and the leader was really just the interpreter. The supervisor remained in the darkened hallway during Betty's examination. He was about 3.5 feet tall. He had a thick neck, broad shoulders, and a barrel test. He had a very large head in proportion to his body with a flat face. He had a very dark iris which filled up the occipital orbit with a vertical pupil in very large eyes and a very broad, flat nose with a wide, thin mouth. He had 3 to 4 short, stubby fingers. His hands were different from the leaders and examiners. 2 of those had a ridge between them, and then there was a tiny finger and thumb. She did not observe any fingernails on this creature, and she couldn't remember whether the leader or examiner had fingernails. This one was very hostile and frightening. This is the one who initiated the conversation about her book that she wanted to take with her as proof that she had been captured. And there was a lot of angry sounds coming from his mouth, and then Betthy was informed that they had decided to take the book away, that she would not remember this experience, and she became angry and stated that she would remember it, that they would never take that memory away, no matter what she did, that somehow she'd remember it. Well, let's go to a comparative analysis of dreams or recall versus the experience. I made another mistake here. The blueprint is dreams or recall. The black print is actually what Betthy and Barney said on the hypnosis tapes. So we see that on the hypnosis tapes, Betthy described a bracket, and then she lies down on a short, hard, light-colored examining table. And Barney also describes a short, hard operating table. He doesn't describe a stool with a bracket. Both Betty's and Barney's eyes are closed during most of this exam. Barney opened his eyes one time. Betthy opened her eyes several times momentarily to peek. Betty's shoes were removed and Barney's shoes were removed. The examiner felt up and down Betty's spine, and the examiner pushed on the skin down Barney's back as if he were counting the spinal column. Barney also added that his ears were checked, his mouth was opened, and 2 fingers were inserted into it, and his skin was scraped very lightly, and his bone structure was examined. Betthy also mentioned in Dreams or Recall that her skin was scraped. So Barney could possibly have received this information from Betthy, but the other information is independent of anything she ever said. Betthy, as we know, underwent a pregnancy test. This was in her dream. And in her dream, she experienced stabbing pain. The examiner moved his hands back and forth in front of her eyes, and all pain was removed. Under hypnosis, he did the same thing, but the pain continued for several minutes. Tears streamed down her face. She showed considerable agony, and Dr. Simon actually decided to end the hypnosis session early due to the degree of trauma that Betthy was experiencing. Barney said that a tube was inserted into his rectum. It was a very small, thin tube, and it was quickly removed, and that a cup-like device that had substance, that had body, that probably had a gel-like solution in it, was placed over his genitals. He felt pressure and a tugging sensation, and that a sperm sample may have been extracted, but he couldn't confirm definitely that it had happened. only that the device was placed over his genitals. This is what Barney told David Baker that he saw when he looked up from the examining table. Now, we all know that Betthy observed a star map on board the craft, and Marjorie Fish researched the star map and identified the stars on the map. Stanton Friedman devotes 2 chapters in our book Captured to the investigation of this star map by Marjorie Fish and a few others. The investigation continues, and people are emailing me practically every week now that they know I've written the book about their investigations. Betthy also looked at a book when she was on board. This is the book that she wanted to take with her. It seemed to be constructed of a thin, stiff, shiny plastic. It was approximately 1 inch thick and about 6 by 9 inches. It was covered with a dark, stiff, thin material, and the text seemed to be embedded in the plastic. There were 6 columns. I asked Betthy to draw this from memory in the year 2000. As you know, 39 years had passed. Her memory was very vague. She did the best she could for me. We shouldn't take this as an exact representation of what she saw. This is just drawn from memory 39 years later. And in Dreams or Recall, during the release from capture, all of the men accompanied Betthy and Barney to the car at the same time. The leader suggested that they wait and watch them leave. Barney seemed to wake up as they approached the car, but showed no emotion. He stood by the front fender of the car while Betthy leaned against the door. She then opened the car door and removed the dog Delsey from underneath the seat. And let's see what happened, what Betthy and Barney said to Dr. Simon during their hypnosis. Betthy said that Barney was escorted to the car first by some of the crew members while she remained behind. And Barney said that he was escorted to the car before Betthy, and actually he sat on his gun when he sat down in the driver's seat. Betthy said a few minutes later she was escorted to the car by the leader, and Barney said that he observed Betthy approaching the car from the driver's seat. Barney was seated in the car, according to Betthy, not standing outside, and Barney, as we know, said that he also was seated in the car. Betthy said that Delsey was on the seat of the car when she arrived. Barney said when he arrived, Delsey was under the seat of the car. She was shivering and shaking, but that she jumped up on the seat. He put his hand down and touched her. They both stood by the car to watch the craft leave. Betthy convinced Barney to get out of the car and watch it leave. And according to Barney, he stood by the car and watched it leave as well. It turned into a swirling mass. It rolled over a couple of times and took off. This is an aerial view of the abduction site. You can see New Hampshire State Highway, Route 175, going north to south. It ran parallel to Route 3. This is Millbrook Road. You can see where the Hills vehicle was parked and where the group of aliens was in the road. The craft would have been over in this area. Barney actually drew this under hypnosis for Dr. Simon, but he had the scene reversed. He had the aliens here in the road and his car here. And when Betthy and Barney left, Barney did not have to turn the car around. It was facing in the right direction. So this will remain a mystery. We don't know how this happened. Betthy and Barney left the abduction site and drove approximately 3.5 miles to their turnoff to Plymouth, New Hampshire. They traveled through Plymouth during the night, and they always remembered seeing a diner along the way. They couldn't locate this diner, but there actually is a diner in downtown Plymouth that's been there for many, many years. They went on to Ashland, where they heard a second series of beeping or buzzing sounds. And Route 93, Interstate 93, had been built as far north as Ashland at that time. Let's review the map again. Here we have Plymouth. Here we have near Ashland the second series of beeping or buzzing sounds. Barney actually stopped the car here and tried to recreate the noise that they were hearing, and he could not recreate that noise. They traveled south on Route 93, about 17 miles from Concord in Northfield. They regained full consciousness and began talking again. They traveled on to Concord and then took the 47 miles back to Portsmouth. I tried to put the H on the end of Portsmouth. It's on my computer at home, but it simply would not come out on my disk. They arrived at approximately daybreak, or approximately 5:15 a.m. They looked at the clocks. Now, if they had taken Route 3, it was approximately 16 miles to Ashland, and they would have arrived in 20 to 30 minutes. If they had turned on Route 175, it was approximately 21 miles. The drive would have been 35 to 40 minutes. They actually arrived in Ashland at about 3:30 a.m. Their turnoff onto the bridge in Thornton was at about 12:45 a.m. So this was the 2-hour period of missing time. When they arrived home, I did a comparative analysis of what they said. Betthy said that it was daylight. When they arrived home, it was dawn anyway. She heard the birds singing as she was walking Delcy outside. Barney said, well, we're arriving home a little later than expected. Betthy said that they didn't say anything to each other, but that if the people were not from this earth, what about radioactivity? What about cosmic rays or viruses? What had they been exposed to? And she asked Barney to place the luggage on the porch and not to bring it into the house. Barney said when he first arrived home, he had a feeling of foreboding that something would happen, that Betthy, let's forget about this whole thing. They went to the windows, they looked up many times, they couldn't see a craft. Betthy said she just had a feeling that Barney knew what had happened, although they didn't discuss it at that point. She said, we just said, well, there they go, you know. Are they still around? And this type of thing, but didn't discuss an abduction or the details. Barney went into the bathroom and looked at his private parts, he said. He thought to himself, this is proof that something had happened to him. But he was unsure, and he would waver, and he'd think, but it can't be. And then he would think, but it did. The following, or actually that afternoon when they woke up, Betthy, after speaking to my mother, went to examine the car. A neighbor of ours who was a physicist suggested through his wife that Betthy take a compass out to the car to see how a compass would react. Betthy went out and she found this series of 12 to 18 highly polished circles about the size of silver dollars on the trunk of the car, and let's listen to what Betthy and Barney had to say about that. Next recording, please.
When she placed it by the car, and I said, oh, this is ridiculous to Betthy. After all, the car is metal, and any metal will attract and cause a compass to react this way. And she said, but look what it does, and look at the spots on my car. And I looked, and there were large spots. shiny spots on the trunk of the car. And I thought, well, what caused that? And I started to wipe one off, and she said, don't touch it. And I said, how can you not know if it isn't anything? And then I put the compass close to it, and the compass would spin and spin, and I could move the compass a few inches to a spot that did not contain, to a part on the trunk that did not have a spot, and the compass would drop down. And I could not understand this, and I knew I did not know anything about compasses. And I told Betthy, it is nothing. After all, the compass is a cheap compass, and there's nothing to get alarmed about. You would place the compass anywhere other than on the spots, it would just flop down. There had been a rain, and where the rain had washed some of the dust off, the shiny spots were still there, and I didn't try to dust them off.
Dr. Simon asked Barney, could these spots have been caused by the raindrops taking the dust off? And Barney replied as follows.
No. The spots were shiny and perfect circles.
Betthy describes the spots on the trunk of the car.
Clear. It was like a lacquer put on over the color. And even when I waxed the car, the spot still was shinier. And it had been raining that day. And the car was all wet, still wet. And I thought, well, I started on the side of the car to see what would happen. And I kept going closer and closer to the trunk. And then it was when I started to go to the trunk with the compass that I noticed the shiny spots on the trunk. That there were these very, very shiny spots. About the whole cluster of them. About the size of, I don't know, $50 or silver dollar, something like that. And there must have been, 12 or 18, there were several, over a dozen, I would say, all around the spot and very shiny. And when I just got the compass anywhere near them, the compass kept spinning around and around and around. And at this I panicked. I got more upset at this one spot than I did at all.
Next, Dr. Simon asked Betthy if it could have been splashings from the rain. She replied,
no, because the car was all wet. And not only that, they stayed for a long time.
Dr. Simon asked Betthy if she tried to wipe them away, and she replied as follows.
Yeah, I washed my car every fall. Every fall, I always, and I usually do it myself, I'd give my car, I did then, a good scrubbing, and I would salmonize it.
Next, Dr. Simon asked Betthy if they eventually went away.
Yeah, during the winter, they gradually went away.
15.
Okay, and that recording. This is the actual...
Dr. Simon asked...
Oops. This is the actual car that Betthy and Barney were driving on the night of their encounter, a blue and white Chevy Bel Air, 1957. And let's listen to the next recording. This is the last recording. Not sure how much time we have left, but Dr. Simon is questioning Barney about how he was convinced that this was real. So let's listen.
Barney Hill, do you think you were abducted?
I feel I was abducted.
Where are you abducted?
Yes.
How do you feel? Were you abducted?
I don't want to believe I was abducted.
But you
So I
are
say,
convinced you were.
I feel, because this make it comfortable for me to accept something I don't want to accept that happened.
What would make it comfortable?
Dr. Simon asks Barney Hill why he feels uncomfortable about saying he was abducted.
Because it is such a weird story. If anyone else told me that this had happened to them, I would not believe them. And I hate very badly to be accused of something that I didn't do when I know I didn't do it, or if I am not believed that I have done something and I know I have done it.
Well, suppose you had.
Dr. Simon suggests to Barney that perhaps he just absorbed Betty's dreams. Perhaps it didn't really happen. And he responds,
No.
Why not?
Because I didn't like them putting that on me.
It's all right. Take it.
"It's all right, take it easy," Dr. Simon says.
I didn't like them putting that on me. I don't like them touching me.
All right, then.
Dr. Simon continues to reassure Barney.
We have only a couple of minutes left. The day, according to Betty, the day they arrived home, she phoned Pease Air Force Base and reported this. This is the original handwritten report. You can see they say that there was a strong inversion in Lincoln, New Hampshire that night. I checked with the Mount Washington Observatory Weather Station. They looked in their archives. There was not. There might have been a weak inversion that set up in some of the lower valleys overnight, but not during their observation. You can also see that in the original report, air intercept radar was X'd. That was not in later reports. This is a picture of Betty and myself at about the time that they had their sighting. My family and I went to their house a couple of days after that and were firsthand witnesses to the physical evidence, the spots on the car, the scrapes on Barney's shoes, the stopped watches, etc. And all of this has developed into a book written by Stanton Friedman and myself, Captured. And I don't think we're going to have time to take questions here. It seems that we've gone quite a long time with this, but if you do have questions, feel free to come up to my table. Stanton Friedman is right next to me and would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. And that's the end, and thank you so much.